Hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 3 of the I Heart 90s History podcast, where we explore how historians study the 1990s. I'm Ben Waterhouse from the University of North Carolina.
And I'm Vinsel from Virginia Tech. For this episode, we're talking to Margaret O'Mara, who is Scott and Dorothy Bullitt Chair of American History at the University of Washington, where she teaches and writes about technology and politics and the interaction between the two.
So we were especially excited to talk to Margaret because those two concepts, technology and politics, fit so well into the themes that we've started unpacking on this podcast about the history of the 90s. In our earlier episodes, which we definitely encourage you to go check out, we talked to David Kirsch about the dot-com era and Angus Bergen about the rise of the internet. And what was implicit in those conversations was that the fast pace of technological change, especially in information technology, became absolutely central to American life in the late 20th century. And Margaret allows us to push that connection further. Many listeners may be familiar with her for her first book, Cities of Knowledge, Cold War Science and the Search for the Next Silicon Valley, which was published in 2004, and more recently for her magisterial biography of Silicon Valley called The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, published in 2020.
Margaret also has a fascinating background when it comes to the politics of the 1990s and the Clinton administration. As a teenager, she was one of the Clinton family's babysitters. Then she got deeply involved in Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign, and after the election, began working in the White House. She wrote about some of those experiences in her book, Pivotal Tuesdays: 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century. Part of our goal in talking to Margaret was to use this conversation to pivot from a set of conversations about Silicon Valley and the dot-com boom and bust to a series of conversations about the Clinton administration and Democratic Party politics in the 1990s, which you'll be hearing about more soon. Our producer, Joe Forte, was also in the virtual room. Joe, what stood out to you about our conversation with Margaret?
Well, I did really appreciate her unique perspective, and that's the perspective she was able to share on Arkansas society, Arkansas politics. She described living across the street from the governor's mansion when Bill Clinton was governor, and how just sort of like intimate and small politics was in that state. And I loved hearing about the evolution of both the political philosophy and the political strategy of the team that the Clintons were, as she described from the beginning. And it was really also interesting, as we spoke about the Clinton presidency, we also talked about, as we do on this podcast, studying the 90s and sort of the timing of historians choosing focus so relatively recent in the past. And the Clinton story was specifically complicated in that discussion because it's still unfolding, right? We talk about that as we spoke with Margaret about how the Clintons are still in the news. And even since we recorded this podcast, there's been testimony from both of them on the Epstein files. And so there's a lot of sort of big plot points still sort of hanging out there with regard to the Clintons. And that sort of dovetailed with the other thing I really liked about talking with Margaret, and that was the way she addressed memory. As it sits in the historian's toolbox, she talked about remembering and misremembering and how that could lead to different sort of questions and directions of inquiry. And we also talked about memory just in a more broader way with regard to things that happened in one's lifetime and how that's in conversation with looking at the history of those times. And that's right in our wheelhouse for this podcast. So that was all very rich.
Yeah, totally. That's really one of the big meta questions of this entire project. How do you reconcile your personal memory, your lived memory, with your kind of objectivity as a historian, and how do we make those decisions? This is a great conversation for bringing those conversations out.
Yeah, totally. So the way we got this conversation started was with our own memories, thinking back to what we were all doing around the time Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992.
All right, can I just tell you about how I wore black to ninth grade on the 4th of November of 1992?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that is actually the entirety of the story, but I remember being a kind of contrarian 14-year-old. So my best friend and I wore like black sweaters or button shirts. I don't even remember what it was, but we like wore whatever black clothing we had in mourning the day after Bill Clinton was elected president. This is in suburban Massachusetts. So you can imagine that this was a minority opinion of the subject. And I think somebody asked if we were mourning the Perot campaign. And I think my friend was. And I think I was actually mourning the Bush administration. And so that was my kind of entree point to this at the age of 14. And the only other thing I remember about that is I remember waking up that morning and my mother was getting ready for work, and she always had Good Morning America on when she was just kind of getting ready in the morning. And they had an interview with Dan Quayle, who was, looked like hell. Like the dude was just, he clearly had been up all night, and he was the one who they got, shoveled off to talk to, Charlie Gibson or whatever about losing. And,
Wow.
And my mother was kind of bummed. She was just sad for the Bush administration. And, she had turned 43 the day before. So she was like a, middle-aged boomer professional woman, and was just like profoundly disappointed that the country had shoveled George H.W. Bush out the door and embraced this Arkansas guy, Bill Clinton.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
These
was
guys.
that was me, and I wore black just to like get the goat of my social studies teacher, who was this giant
Wow.
Massachusetts liberal Democrat.
Wow. Wow.
So welcome to our
Hey.
podcast,
Yeah.
Margaret. It's
Welcome
great
to the
see you.
90s.
That's right. But I share that only to kind of segue to you and ask you, what do you remember about that election night? Where were you on election night 1992?
Where was I? Well, let me start with where was I on election day? Because it's now I reflect back on it, and I'm like, well, of course I became a political historian. I started election day in a bank vault in Detroit, counting money, putting cash in envelopes for what was then colloquially known as walking around money, or also quote unquote volunteer reimbursements for the Michigan campaign. I had spent the whole of since June of 92, I'd been working as an employee of the Clinton Gore 92 campaign and in Little Rock headquarters, Little Rock being my hometown. I've got the best origin story of any unemployed history major ever. I graduated in June 92 without a job, went home to my childhood bedroom and thought, well, maybe I'll just volunteer in the campaign for a while while I figure out what I really want to do. Anyway, I worked on the campaign. The last several weeks of it, I went up to Michigan to get out the vote for the swing states, and then flew. After doing my counting the cash in the bank vault, there was just a pile of $20,000 on the table in front of us, and we were sitting there putting it in envelopes. Oh yeah, that's where we're old. I went from there to the airport, got on a flight to Little Rock. I'm sure I had to connect through Chicago or something because there's very few things like that. There's no direct flight to Little Rock from most places. And I show up and go straight to campaign headquarters, which was in a building that was a couple blocks away from the old State House, which is where the victory party was going to be. And by that point, the legendary War Room, which was the place presided over by James Carville and George Stephanopoulos throughout the campaign.
Did it still have the sign on it?
Oh yeah. Oh heck yeah. Yeah. The whiteboard was there. Other signs kind of printed out were all over the room.
Lee, this is the
And
sign that said it's the economy stupid.
it's the economy. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
it was a whiteboard that said
Nice.
healthcare, always healthcare. It's the economy stupid. And then the third thing that I can't remember now, but I should. and there were signs also printed out in kind of proto Microsoft Word in black and white that said "Speed kills." That was all about it's a 24-hour news cycle, and the fastest you are to the story, you're on top of the story. So these things have really embedded
Wow.
themselves in my psyche. But I walk in there by about, I'm guessing it was probably around 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. No, it was maybe a little closer. Happy hour was well underway. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
The returns were coming in. Whiskey had been broken out. A lot of whiskey. There were some people standing on desks. It was as wild and crazy as early '90s campaign people could get. Policy wonks. People were loosening their ties.
Did you know that it was in the bag?
Yes. Although actually people more seasoned than me were more confident. And even it was interesting, the last week or so of the campaign, it was pretty clear that Clinton was going to win. And I didn't believe it. I was still a kind of newbie and I didn't understand why the elders around me, the campaign professionals, were kind of getting like, okay, this is going to happen. The polling was just trending our way. And Ross Perot, thank God for Ross Perot. I mean, he is why Bill Clinton became president, because it split the vote.
Wow.
The Bush campaign's major calculation, much to the sadness of you and your mom, Ben, was that they thought that Ross Perot was going to bleed votes from Bill Clinton. And in fact, he was more of an impact on Bush. It was a change election, and Bill Clinton was the change candidate. I mean, it's always a change election. Let's be clear. When is it not a change election?
It's always the most important election of our lifetime.
It always is. It always is. Yeah. So after some, I was not a big whiskey drinker at the time, nor am I now, but I think I had some of that extended happy hour whiskey. And then everyone kind of, as an en masse, kind of made their way down by the evening time, just down the street to where they closed off the streets to the old State House. And we stood there below the portico as Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Al and Tipper Gore came out, and it was victory. It was extraordinary. And I sat there going, holy cow, the governor of Arkansas is president. Does anyone know how small Arkansas is? I mean, I'd grown up in Little Rock dying to get out of there and successfully escaped. And then I'm like, holy cannoli. Does anyone realize that a state of 2 million people has just elected this president? And he was someone that, if you grew up in Arkansas in the 80s, you knew Bill Clinton because it's a tiny place. And so, it was really kind of extraordinary and continues to just blow my mind.
Joe, what do you remember about it?
Well, first, I'm curious, growing up in Arkansas and Little Rock, what was your sense of Bill Clinton before that election cycle?
Well, Bill Clinton is the most charismatic human being I have ever encountered in my life. Full stop. The guy has a glow, an aura, a something that is this magnetism that transcends his well-known women problems, but is something that, and no less than Newt Gingrich agrees with me on this. You can be his political rival, and you can be, no matter your gender, no matter what. If you come in the force field that is Bill Clinton, and I remember, like as a young person, I was in third grade when he was elected governor. I lived in the house I grew up in was, and this. Trust me, this makes me sound fancier than I am, but Arkansas is not fancy and everything's tiny. But I grew up in a house across the street from the governor's mansion, and which my husband, who was a New Yorker, when he first came to visit Little Rock in the late '90s, he's like, "This is it." So let's just calibrate. But yeah, there's this intimacy. So, but even with that intimacy and kind of like, oh, I'd come home from college and go for a run in the neighborhood, and the governor would be running in the neighborhood, and you'd say hi, and
Wow.
That even with that intimacy, I still remember every time I met him, because you get in this force field of where for the 30 seconds, 45 seconds that you're in conversation with him, you are the most important person in the world, and all he wants is your vote. Doesn't matter if you're not a voter or if he's not running for office. He has this extraordinary political intelligence and this combination of he's a total political animal, and he's an ultimate policy wonk. And that combination is extraordinarily rare.
Yeah, he's a nerd, is what I read.
He is a big nerd. Yes, and he really digs deep in the weeds of policy, and also just can do the what needs to be done, the glad handing and the politicking that needs to happen. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, that charisma is something I came to know publicly, right, during his 8 years, and but I wasn't on board with that like at first, right? When this was like this election and the one previous, and the lead up to it, were a kind of a political awakening for me in college, right? That's when I started to pay attention, and immediately I was just, so obviously my experience of 92 is not as insider as yours or as contrarian as Ben's, but it's contrary. I thought of it as contrarian because, like,
hey, 38%
Margaret,
of the country was on my side.
Yeah.
I felt there was this inevitability to the like Reagan Bush thing to keep rolling on, and I was hesitant to embrace the polls, but I was I was immediately out of the gate as left as I remain today. Like, like that's where I went and that's where I stayed. And so Clinton didn't appeal to me because of that. But yeah, I remember if they were talking about memories of that election night, I remember I was out of college, but I was still hanging out with people in my college town in a house where we had done a lot of, sort of just drinking and talking and hanging out. And we had we drew a map on the wall and we colored in states, and like it was kind of like a party atmosphere. But yeah, those are my memories. They're tightly connected to my political awakening, my starting to pay attention to politics and society generally, I suppose. So it's key for me in that way.
Margaret and Ben, something Joe and I have talked about riffing off that before is like how with the Democrats, this is kind of famous, but I feel like we don't talk about it enough, that in the primaries, there's often people further to the left than like who ends up getting chosen, right? And that's happened like again and again. And like the 90s were this kind of real centrist moment, though. I mean, that's kind of like something people say about it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think you can't think about, it's impossible to think about the 92 election without the shadow of 88. And one of the interesting things about the Clinton campaign is there were a heck of a lot of Dukakis 88 people on it. In fact, so much so that, there were some differences, but it was all, the entire campaign was staffed with people had been in the White House wilderness for 12 years. So no one had been in the executive branch. There were lots of former congressional staffers. People like George Stephanopoulos, for example, had worked on the Hill their whole career. It was a very young campaign. The people like George were 10 years older than me, which means they were in their early 30s. They seemed impossibly old, and now they seem impossibly young to me. That there was that the coming out of the Dukakis defeat in 88, there's this very famous, post-mortem by Bill Galston and Elaine Kmark, who are kind of famous DLC, Democratic Leadership Council policy aides that then become Clinton aides and go on and on beyond that. That's like, we have to completely, turn away from this left, we've been painted as liberal because keep in mind, Mike Dukakis was not a lefty at all.
He was
a
center
centrist
of Jesse Jackson, right?
Yeah. So he was the centrist solution of 1988, and then he very successfully was painted by Lee Atwater and George H.W. Bush as a liberal, and making that a dirty word. So there's this real, kind of political pragmatism that is just suffusing the Clinton campaign in going to 92. Just in ways that kind of triumphed. We talk about the 90s kind of being the, reality bites, ironic, Gen X. We kind of were, like, to be earnest and to be, it was not cool. Like, and I'll say that even as a very young person, I was, I didn't have this political earnestness that I see on display and at other times and other moments in history. There just wasn't that kind of, sure, there were plenty of true believers. I don't want to sort of speak for everyone, but there was kind of this, we're going to do what it takes to win. And I also came onto the campaign, by June, by the time someone like me shows up and the nomination is pretty much in hand, there's been such a bruising primary. I mean, it's just been so nasty, and there's that you're doing what it takes.
So the generational aspect of this is fascinating to me because on the one hand you have someone like you, Margaret, who at the time, well, it was sort of, and you and Joe, I think, probably prime Gen X by kind of birth cohort, and then like me, a bit younger at the very end of that cohort, but still a kid. Bill Clinton himself is in his early 40s.
Yeah.
Right. So he is the oldest baby boomer you can be.
Yeah.
Right. So even in the 20 years between you and him, or 20 some years, I guess, it's still a generational change. But I guess the question is this the baby boomers' time to shine with all of their sort of 60s optimism and, don't stop thinking about tomorrow stuff? Or is it the Gen X, who were, at the time, the youngest people possibly involved with that sort of cynicism and try hard is not cool and all that kind of.
Right.
I wish we had the term try hard in the 90s. That would have been so great.
Exactly.
I love that exists today. But anyway, I mean, what do you make of this? And this is sort of asking you to put the historian hat on, not necessarily the participant hat. But it's a generational shift, but it's a shift from the older, like the Reagan and Bush generation, and to the baby boomers.
Yeah. And this was very much a baby boom presidency. That's true. The people who were in the positions of power at the top, the people who were in the Senate confirmed cabinet secretary and sub-cabinet positions were baby boomer age. Bill Clinton and Al Gore were 45 and 46 when they were elected. Which now, again, to me, at age 55, seems impossibly young. And also now in our age of the gerontocracy seems impossibly young. And that was, and that also contoured the whole campaign, which was about Vietnam and kind of what the litmus test of what happens, what did you do or not do with the Vietnam War.
It was only 17 years afterwards, which at the time seemed like forever. But, today that would be like talking about 2008.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's like, what did you do in the financial crisis? What did you do in Vietnam? It's about the same. And so, and it was very, the Clintons as a duo, and I think it is worth kind of thinking of them as a political duo. Not only because of her subsequent political career, but because of sort of the role that Hillary played throughout his governorship and his presidency and his presidential run. Interestingly. Joe, you probably would have liked the 1978-79 vintage Bill Clinton, who, he came into the governor's office when he was elected at age 31, just shockingly young. And it was a 2-year term then for Arkansas governor. And they came in and they were like, we're going to change the world. And there was lots of baby boomer idealism. And it was all of their friends from, Wellesley and Washington, D.C. And they were coming in hot. And Hillary didn't change her name, and she still wore her glasses. She didn't dye her hair. And Arkansas did not like that. That was a little
dye her
nudge.
hair. What color should she have dyed her hair?
Well, she had dark dark blonde hair that sort of photo, and then she lightened it. So he's elected in 78. He's unelected. He's defeated in 80. He comes back in 1982 as and look, he's governing Arkansas. He is like attuned to the will of the voters, but it also he comes in as a more centrist.
Interesting.
Politician. Hillary Clinton is now Hillary Rodham Clinton, wearing contacts and has a blonde bob. So there's that. Incidentally, Hillary Clinton was the first married woman I'd ever encountered in my life at age 8 who'd kept her unmarried name. So that's Arkansas in 1978 for you. So there was a real, but they had a real kind of reformist urge. They came in, with education programs and healthcare and anti-poverty programs and a lot of things that were very, kind of not centrist in the least. And
so Democrat.
Yeah. So there was a real kind of calculus and a real shift. And that just, that was part of what made his national reputation as a leader of the DLC, the Democratic Centrist Organization, which was about let's figure out a way in the Reagan era how to get beyond liberalism. It was neoliberalism of kind of its first, in its kind of classic iteration,
Yeah, it's like neoliberal with a hyphen almost.
With a hyphen, with a hyphen.
Neo-hyphen liberalism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so among your scholarly work is this book, Pivotal Tuesdays, that came out now 10, 12 years ago. Am I right about that?
10 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. Which is great for classroom teaching, I will say. I have used it with great success. And just so listeners know, the Tuesdays in question are election days. And this is a survey of 4 particularly important presidential elections across the 20th century with sort of interstitial chapters summarizing the big movements in political history that kind of shaped and were shaped by those elections. The last of which is the 1992 election. And so, which is where you spell out your actual role in this and your experience as a staffer. I'm curious as a historian and just someone who's interested in the period, but also the writing of history, what it was like to write the 92 chapter as history. That's good. And what did you, how'd you feel about that?
I'm glad you asked that question. It was humbling. That's what it was. So the genesis of Pivotal Tuesdays was actually a set of 4 public lectures I delivered at UW in the fall of 2012. So that was the Obama-Romney election cycle. And as you all may know, putting together 4 public lectures that are televised, they're scripted, that in 4 consecutive weeks was a massive amount of work. And my husband, after witnessing me going through that whole process, he's like, well, why don't you just turn that into a book? And which is a very good idea. Thank you, Jeff, for that idea. And so with some revision and expansion and all that, that was the genesis of it. So I started with those. The 4, it was 1912, 1932, 68, and 92. And 92 I had chosen for the series because I'm like, well, that makes sense. I'll tell I was a staffer and da. So, but when I actually turned to turning this into a book manuscript, and also with this assumption, like, well, I remember what happened. This is going to be an easy lift, right? And I'm going to have insider knowledge that people don't have. And well, first of all, I knew nothing about the inside of the Bush campaign or the Perot campaign because I wasn't on them. And so I had to approach those really fresh. And it also just simply the entire research process, including into the Clinton campaign itself and the Clinton archives, was humbling in that I misremembered so much. And if anything, it has been incredibly useful to me in understanding both the bounty and the limitations of oral history and first-person accounts. It really, and it kind of actually was the perfect ramp up for me then in my book after that, which was the code about Silicon Valley, where I did a ton of interviews of people and I was asking them to recall events of 20, 30, 40, 50 years prior. I understood even when even when it's me and I have this idea about this is the way 92 went. I totally forgot things. I misplaced times and dates and people, even big things. Like
what was the biggest thing, do you think?
I think
Yeah.
I had memory hold the whole timeline of Ross Perot dropping out and coming back in. I just
Yeah.
completely, like, he was there, and then I kind of like, oh yeah, he dropped out, and then he came back.
And it
Yeah.
was weird. There was like the explanation was always very vague. It had
His
to do with
daughter's
like Republican
wedding.
sabotage of his daughter's wedding and
Yeah, it was weird. It was weird.
his position in the polls changed, right? I mean, he was
Yeah.
like way up there
Way
in the
up there.
spring before he dropped out.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it's a real. In fact, he was number one in the polls the day I signed on the Clinton campaign. So I was also
In
thinking like
June, you said, right?
in June, yeah, the beginning of June. When I was thinking to myself, well, I'll do this for like a little over the summer. Then I'm going to go to like a real place and do a real thing. Because
Has that ever been explained to your knowledge? Like, are you satisfied with that whole story?
No, it's not clear. Yeah, it's very clear. I think that and it is, unsurprisingly, the Perot election, the archive is not rich.
Interesting.
There. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so it's a really interesting exercise. I'm glad I did it. With all those caveats, I think the fact that I had lived it brought a perspective to those two chapters, the final, the fourth election that wouldn't have been, I couldn't do to the others. I mean, there is something. It's both, it's both of an asset and it can give you blind spots. I think that the dangerous thing is that you ask questions you wouldn't normally ask, and you also forget to ask some important questions.
Did you talk to the Clintons at all?
I didn't. No, I sent him a copy of the book. Like, hey, didn't get a response. And they were in mine. I sent him a copy of my other book. No, I didn't. I didn't do any interviews for that. It was interesting. The other thing about Pivotal Tuesdays is I kind of, because it was a book, I had the classic historian's second book problem where I was totally grinding my gears on a project that eventually became the code, but was something completely different at that point. And Pivotal Tuesdays kind of presented itself to me as a really kind of a way through that writer's block and that second book problem. And I really didn't approach it like a historical monograph. That I kind of was like, well, these elections have been, there's so much good secondary literature. I'm not going to try to, I'm gonna just approach this in a more synthetic fashion rather than sort of addressing
Ben
it
and
as
I both have done that. It's
Totally.
It's
and
cool
it
work.
seems to be the book that sells the best.
It turns out, because there's so much good scholarship out. It's like, well, okay,
Right.
and also, things that were easily sort of a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of primary source material. So, so would I? And it's interesting, like, if I went back. I've toyed with, and I say this with some reluctance because I don't think I'm going to write this book, or at least not in any time in the near future. But I've toyed with the idea of a dual biography of the Clintons, of writing one, because I think there is something there. There's
that'd
a
be
really
cool, actually.
interesting story there. I just think everyone, including me, needs more temporal distance from the whole thing before it can be written about in a way that would really do it. Justice as a piece of history.
I mean, that's an interesting issue we're dealing with on this podcast, and we're actually going to talk to like Bruce Schulman, one of the early historians of the 70s, about this whole issue, like
This
how
temporal
to do it well.
distance.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing that I've been surprised at from my own perspective is how my personal view of the problem of temporal distance has changed as I have aged, right? Bruce Schulman was writing about the 70s in 2001 is when his book came out. And I was reading it in like 2003 when I started graduate school. And I was like, yeah, we can do the 70s. And I was 25. And if you do the same math today, I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. That seems a little like we need, as you just said, Margaret, we need more time. We need more distance. We can't possibly talk about the Clinton administration. And yet 20 years ago, we did it for the previous, the 2 decades previous.
Well, actually, I think we can talk about the Clinton administration. I think the 90s is totally fair game. I think the Clintons themselves, they've continued to make news well into the 2020s.
Yeah.
And that's the rub, right?
So last week even.
Yes. So it's a moving. Talk about
That's
it. Like,
true.
Yeah.
You could cut it off at some date, though.
You can. I mean, trade editors don't like that very much, but you
That's
can. You can. But the 90s are, I think, really kind of coming into their own. And the dust has settled. And here's another benchmark I have this is my teaching benchmark is that window's shifted a lot. We now have traditional college age students who were all born in this century. Most of them born after 9/11, 2001. There are things like when I ask my students, given these open-ended questions at the end of the U.S. survey, like what are some things that you would love to learn about in a history class that you just it hasn't been taught yet to you yet? What do you want to know? And they want to know about the Iraq War, and they want to know about gun culture and mass shootings and why the NRA is so powerful. They want to know about things that are, for us middle-aged folk, like, well, that's a little too soon. But I think there's my benchmarks, 25 years, dust is settled. You can kind of build out the contours. And look, I do not practice any of this I write about, very alive tech moguls, which it makes me tear my hair out. But it's very difficult, but there are some things you can perceive. Certainly the 90s you guys are in it. We're in it. It's good. We're okay.
All right. Well, so let's do it. Lee, you had a question about the 90s.
Yeah.
Hang on a second. Here's a question about
Joe.
temporality before we move on, right?
Yeah, good.
I
love it.
So Ben, your perspective changed, and Margaret, you're saying the 90s is fair game. I'm wondering, because it's settled, is what you said, right? So, is there something about acceleration that plays into this, right? Like the acceleration of technological change, of societal change, and a 24-hour news cycle and things like this. Is an accelerated pace settling things faster than it used to?
I don't know.
Is that playing into...
You asked 3 historians about accelerating change, and you're going to get grumpy answers.
I'm sorry.
No.
You violated. See, Joe, this is why you're here, bud. You got to violate the...
Yeah.
So what then plays into whether or not something is settled? I
think that's a good question.
It says we've moved on from that. Things are different enough that it's settled.
Oh, I think when I say settled, I think of the dust settling after the building collapse. I don't think any argument's settled. Otherwise, we historians would be out of business, right? Like our whole business is disrupting and troubling the archive, troubling the narrative, going back and saying, well, what if you looked at it this way? But I do, to your point about not really acceleration, but I think one of the things, the hallmarks of the, commercial internet age, and it is information overload. And the kind of intensity of the spin cycle of the news cycle that actually begins with cable news. And one of the things I write about in Pivotal Tuesdays about the 1992 election is how this is kind of the first CNN election in so many dimensions.
Interesting.
It's that cable news provides free media for one. Also, it elevates the bar for what is news drops dramatically because you have so much time to film. So when it's the evening news of 30 minutes, when it's Walter Cronkite and company sort of deciding what's important to put in front of America's eyeballs for 30 minutes, that's a high bar. And so
breaking news is something that everyone knew was going to happen.
Yeah. And so now you just have, so that's one of the reasons, contributes to the kind of scandal driven politics of 80s and 90s and beyond. It's information overload to break through. You've got to just, true crime and sex scandals and all this stuff. And then just launder it again and again and again every hour on the hour because you got 24 hours.
And that does accelerate, Joe. I think you can trace... CNN circa 1985 is slow potatoes, right? And then in the 90s, and then it's like 96, I think, is that when Fox is created and MSNBC comes along a couple of years after that. And so by the time you get into the period of 9/11 and the Iraq War in the 2000s, you've got this new ecosystem. And then, of course, putting news on social media a couple of years after that also ratchets it. So it's a process. And I think as historians, we can see that as an accelerating process. it might not be that time itself accelerates, but a specific thing like media consumption does.
Right. That's like how I read Settled, right? Like if the cable news cycle ceases to be the thing that controls how we're digesting all this, then it becomes fair game for historians, right? Like as something is still alive and dynamic and change, like for example, social media. You're not going to write a history of like the way social media carries sort of perspectives around an election or something like that. But CNN,
there's stuff on it, but it's sociological. Yeah, I think as historians, we probably wouldn't tackle it yet.
Yeah, but we can talk about its first 10 years, right? Sort of maybe.
Well, and this problem, of course,
that brings
also
your
came up,
moguls
Margaret,
in.
with this is also something you dealt with in the Code, which is your biography of Silicon Valley. Which you do bring up to as close to the present as you can, but it doesn't. No history feels the same when you're wrapping it up. In compared to the meat of it when it's kind of in the case of a sort of biography style book that you wrote, the earlier periods.
Yeah.
So Margaret, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on, and it's fun to have you here, is that we knew we could talk to you about a couple different 90s topics. So we also want to get you on to talk to you about Silicon Valley a little bit. And I wanted to kind of transition to that conversation in two ways. And the first is that how was the Clinton administration, in your experience, like being a part of it, like in the offices, like how was it relating to Silicon Valley? I mean, there's this kind of narratives out there about those neoliberals we were talking about, the New Democrats and the Atari Democrat, like these, that there is like the parties having some relationship. Al Gore is seen as being a part of that. How did that continue into the White House in your
Yeah, for sure. But in a different way. I mean, the Silicon Valley of 1992 was still one dominated by hardware companies like HP and Apple to some degree, although Steve Jobs famously kind of always had these Democrats like from Gary Hart forward trying to pursue him and get an endorsement. And he's like, whatever.
Was he at Apple? Was he back at Apple by 92?
He's still in the wilderness. So John Sculley, who was CEO of Apple, who was the one who famously fired Steve in 1985 and was still around in 92. Apple is not having a good run, but Sculley is really tight with the transition. And in fact, so Clinton and Gore have this economic conference in Little Rock in December of 92 during the transition period. And so where tech functioned in that, so there were two things. One, there was this famous kind of group endorsement by Silicon Valley CEOs, including the CEO of HP, who was a Republican, a number of former Republicans or Republicans endorsing Clinton Gore in September of 92, which was a big deal because up until then, Silicon Valley had been very rock-ribbed Republican, Reaganite. Democrats were few and far between. And in terms of the CEO class, because they're business people, that was just what it is.
Anti-regulatory, anti-labor.
But they were really seen as tech was not seen. I mean, certainly Al Gore was the technologist in chief and kind of a super geek and early adopter and was really interested in the science of all of it too, kind of on the academic side. And Clinton wasn't that interested in the details, but he likes powerful people and rich people and smart people, and tech people are those things. And so, but in the beginning, tech was kind of, Sculley's a great example. Like Sculley was there not because he was Steve Jobs and kind of this magical, think different sort of guy. He was a CEO of a company that was a quote unquote new economy company. This is the age of the famous new economy, right? And tech was part of that. And so Clinton, at the first State of the Union, in the First Lady's box, which is where all the, symbolically significant people sit, flanking Hillary Clinton on one side, Alan Greenspan on the other, John Sculley. Dun, dun. So there's your new economy in a nutshell.
Holy shit,
exactly. So. But in those first term, and so I was there during the first term in the White House, and I remember there was one guy in the press office who was like the online, the internet guy, and he had, and
I think every office has that guy, right?
Yeah, but no, everyone was like, what is he? This is so weird. Like, who's on the internet? Or he's sort of like, first it was like bulletin board guy, like the electronic bulletin boards. And then in his office was, if I remember correctly, it was like a former janitor's closet with no windows. Like this was not a big thing. And it was kind of like, oh, this is Gore's kind of information superhighway thing that no one really understands, whatever. We're just busy here doing healthcare. And then a couple of years later, I actually went and worked in Gore's office, not on internet stuff, not on tech stuff. I was working on empowerment zones, which is the, urban reinvestment policy. And I remember, when I was, again, in the Clinton archives researching for the code, and I'm looking up these memos about the Gore's having these groups of Silicon Valley people come, and this is sort of 96, 97, to come to the White House for meetings. And I suddenly had this flash of like, oh my gosh, I was in the room next door to the room where it happened. And I remember them walking down the hall. And I'm like, who are these dorks in their khakis and their blue shirts with no ties? Like, who's not wearing a suit at the White House? That's weird. And so there I was, history happening right next door, and me being like, oh, I'm just here working on my, commerce grant. I don't know. I just missed the whole thing. Another
That's
moment
hilarious.
of humility. Yeah.
For whatever it's worth, I have the exact same feeling about the founding of Facebook, which was like across the street from the Harvard History Department library that I was studying for graduate school exams in when Zuckerberg was creating it.
All right.
Nice.
Questionable life choices on off.
Seriously,
our
it went
part.
the wrong way.
No, so that's awesome, Margaret, because I think that really nicely sets up the next transition question I wanted to ask you, which is about your cities of knowledge, and your first book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the subtitle of that was Cold War Science and the Search for the Next Silicon Valley,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, I imagine that grew out of your dissertation, or
It did. Yeah.
And so you were thinking about Silicon Valley already pretty early, right?
I was. The dissertation. So I had the kind of, fortune, right place, right time. Who knows what? I did, against the advice of my dissertation committee, I moved across the country while I was writing my dissertation. I was at grad school at Penn. I finished my comps, and it was the spring of 2000. And I was newly married, and my husband, we decided he had gotten a job offer at a .com startup in Silicon Valley earlier that spring, and we had decided to, what the heck, let's move to California just for fun.
Which we could add is the peak of the .com bubble.
Yeah.
Right before the NASDAQ drops.
We moved into our apartment the day the NASDAQ was at its highest point ever.
Wow.
And so it was we were there for all of the downhill. So timing. And I find myself but still the boom is still booming in, late 2000, early 2001, when I am sitting in a coffee shop in San Francisco, just like you, Ben, just right next door to where people are doing the things. And I'm like, what am I doing with my life? I have made terrible life choices. But being there kind of got me, made me realize that universities were the central actors of my story. And Stanford's role in the foundation of Silicon Valley was really critical, and also helped me appreciate, how the valley's origins, where it had come from, and that this was an unlikely place to become what it was in the 40s, and also that the entire tech community had a severe case of collective amnesia. When you talked about the role of government and this really is continued for years and years and years. Now I don't have to convince people as much. But when you tried to sort of push back on the free market miracle they were convinced that they were engaged in, and say, the defense, there was a lot of defense contracting then, and there still is. They were like, no. It was all just Steve Jobs in a garage, and, kind of magically all this tech appeared. And the secret of Silicon Valley is that government got out of the way, which is not the case at all. So
the
cities of knowledge.
historiographical side note, but to this, by the way, that's the same year that you were, 2001, that Lisa Madur's Suburban Warriors came out, and it's not, I don't think, a coincidence that she spends the whole first chapter of that book making just that point.
Yeah.
That, like, all through the 40s and 50s and 60s, this is what was undergirding the California tech miracle.
Yes. She, like me, was driven crazy by all of these tech people being like, it's just a free market, you know. Like, there's no such thing as a free market. Stop.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, so one question I wanted to ask you about, you wrote this whole book on the history of Silicon Valley, is like, when you think of the 90s in Silicon Valley, how is it different than what happened there before? Was there what was changing during that time?
It was a profound transformation, and one that's kind of harder to see. Well, sometimes it's kind of what's forgotten is that Silicon Valley, up until the commercialization of the internet and the dot-com boom, was really primarily a computer hardware place. And for some time, it was a manufacturing place, chips and computers. The software, up until, up until the time of, Bill Gates and Paul Allen figured out how to make desktop software a very lucrative business. Software was just not a standalone industry. And what happens in the 1990s is this confluence of deregulation, the Telecom Act of 1996, that is sort of pumping all of this money and opportunity into the system in terms of infrastructure, as well as kind of creating rules of the road for the internet that create a pretty smooth runway for the growth of the industry, and was very favorable to the internet industry as the kind of the David among the Goliaths of the telecoms. So that's a rich irony there. And also the Wall Street and financialization. Thank you, Alan Greenspan. So Alan Greenspan, sitting next to Hillary Clinton, played a role in that. And the stock market booming, a lot of money looking for a home and putting it in tech stocks. And this turned Silicon Valley into the new Wall Street, that you have MBAs. So some of the, I started grad school in 1997. Friends of mine who started at Wharton, again, different life choices, in 1997. 2 years later, were going out to the Valley because that's where, money was going to be made. It suddenly, people have been making money. There have been Ferraris in Silicon Valley before the late 90s. But the late 90s is kind of when it becomes this sort of a different kind of business story. And it's entirely a software story. It's software networking. And then when you move into the post-dot-com boom Silicon Valley, and then really after the financial crisis of 2008, you get the supersized Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley 2.0, 3.0, utterly different in scale and scope, and wealth, and kind of fun than ever before. So there's these really distinctive, I only wrote the code. I brought the code up to what was then the present day, the June 2018, as I turned in my manuscript, at my editor's suggestion, because it was a trade book. And at first I bristled at it because I was like, well, I'm going to enter the dot-com bust, and that's fine. I was, again, doing the 25-year rule of like, that's history, and I'm just going to stop there. And I'm so glad I did the last section. It was very difficult to write. It was the hardest one to write.
Oh, interesting.
Because it was so present tense and so moving. It gave a narrative logic to the rest of the book. It kind of helped me focus the rest of the narrative on all we're doing is we're figuring out how we get to now, the now being the platform era. Not to be presentist, but to be like, okay, is this phenomenon, is this moment, is this person, is this company helping us understand how we get to now? And that writing about the 21st century Valley helped me properly understand that this was kind of a new animal altogether. It still had the same building blocks and a lot of the same players and same people deciding the winners, and the same networks. So but the product is different. The impact is different. It migrates from being a technology that you have on your desk and then you turn off at the end of the day and leave, to this ubiquitous, it's in everything. It's everywhere.
Do you think, was the 90s part of a transition as well in the kind of cultural place of Silicon Valley? I mean, in particular, I've always been curious, or I've been curious about when tech companies became archetypal big business, or if they ever did. I mean, I know there's a tech exceptionalism, right? That people in that industry like to say that we're not the same as those big bad smokestack industries. Yeah. And for a while, that seemed to be a winning argument, but my sense is that it's less of a winning argument. But you're big
Ben,
business,
the master of understatement today.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, how do you trace that sort of trajectory?
Yeah. It was, I think, in the 80s and the 90s together, from the personal computer, when the personal computer moves in and it becomes, Time's Machine of the Year in 1982 to through the 1990s. The Silicon Valley story is not the sort of business page one story. It's still sort of off to the side of the main act of American capitalism. But it is a very exciting, sexy story where it's a kind of the phoenix rising from the ashes of the 1970s and the ashes of the manufacturing economy. It's one of the reasons that New Democrats kind of embrace it. So such enthusiasm. This is a business we can get our heads around. No smokestacks, although terribly polluting, but we just hide it.
Yeah.
And it's these companies helmed by figures like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, these new style CEOs. So there's a sort of a fascinating story to be told simply by looking at Time magazine's covers featuring tech CEOs from the 80s and the 80s and 90s, and just the way that they're being portrayed. These golden geeks. That was the headline of the issue that featured Mark Andreessen, who was then the 24-year-old co-founder of Netscape. Now he is a venture capitalist and vocal Trumpist and defender of writer of manifestos, various. He was a golden geek, and this kind of fascination with these, and Jeff Bezos, and when in his pleated khakis and books era, before we went on all Iron Man on us. So there's a real there's been a lot of transformations. I mean, that's why I can't stop writing and talking about these guys, because they just give me so much material. But it's an interesting, but it's still kind of off to the side. It isn't the big, and the line that they're sort of selling, kinder, gentler capitalism, is one that is really compelling. And then it kind of really reaches its apex with the, Google, founded in 1997-8 by a couple of, nerdy the ultimate golden geeks, these computer science graduate students, building a campus that's this fantastical, extra nice version of a college campus with free food and bicycles everywhere and sunshine. And shutting down to go to Burning Man and giving people, climbing walls and heated toilet seats and everything in between. That even as it becomes big, there's this, and I think the idea that we're still just a startup and we're scrappy outsiders is something that really is embedded deeply in the psyche of the leaders of these companies, even to this day, which, so that's why we have these aggrieved billionaires who are like, everyone's doesn't understand us. They're being so mean to us. We're so discriminated against. And you're like, dude, you have $100 billion. Like, what are you talking about? So, but I digress.
I did want to ask you one thing about the dot-com bubble and bust. And the reason I'm asking you this is because we're maybe in another tech bubble moment. We witnessed that Silicon Valley's gone through multiple tech bubbles, right? Even during this history that you've been writing. So, I mean, how do you think of that story these days, and connections like American culture and these kind of broader historical trends?
I'm thinking a lot about these connections. Well, the dot-com bubble and bust was it was both hard stuff and soft stuff. The soft stuff being the internet companies, the kind of the bids for e-commerce, famously pets.com, buying dog food on the internet. It was a too soon sort of idea. Subsequent companies, Chewy et al. Have proved very successfully that you can sell dog food on the internet, but the infrastructure just wasn't there yet. So there was a lot of kind of, and then this is fueled by the market. This is all this kind of, irrational exuberance that's plowing into this enthusiasm about stocks. It's retail investors as well as institutional ones. The hype cycle is really, really intense. It's being kind of egged on by deregulation and rhetorical encouragement from the Clinton side, wiring schools to the internet is going to solve all our educational problems. Yeah, that worked. But that was really, it was kind of, and it was this kind of ultimate neoliberal play at a time when Republicans had taken control of both houses of Congress and were stopping any social legislation in its tracks. And so what are you going to do? Like, let's put some internet on it. And and Newt Gingrich was a great technophile as well. I think there's something to be said for the fact that the vice president and the speaker of the House were both major early adopter super geeks about this stuff and recognized the platform shift that was the internet well before others did. And it was indeed a platform shift. It just was a too soon thing. So that's the soft side. On the hard side, the dot-com boom was also about infrastructure and wires and things. And the internet is a series of tubes, turns out.
Right.
And so there was this huge build out of broadband, fiber optic networks, all those things that were largely unused because there just was not stuff to put in those tubes. And there weren't people, there wasn't demand. It was very similar to the Transcontinental Railroad, built ahead of demand. So much so that you have a lot of unused track, and you have bankruptcies. This happens.
And fraud and all kinds of stuff.
And fraud and all sorts of things. And so this happens with the railroad. This happens with the dot-com boom and bust. And what's happening right now? We're having a lot of infrastructure build out and a lot of highly leveraged, debt.
Well, it does feel
and
similar
everything you just said about the
days.
internet, you could just swap in the word AI. And
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sounds very familiar.
Sounds very familiar. So then this is, so I think it's important too. I think that the parallel is useful in thinking, well, yeah, the internet was a platform shift. It was an economically transformative move. I have a little more, I think AI is it applies to so many things that, of course, yes, transformative. It was it's advanced computing, and it includes, machine learning and generative AI, and it also includes protein folding and, solving really thorny medical problems, scientific questions that can't be solved otherwise. So there's a lot of there. Does that mean OpenAI is going to be profitable anytime soon? I don't know.
Joe, I'm wondering, if we got to wrap up soon, just because we have a time cap at soon. But Joe, I wonder if there's any question you want to ask just to get it on tape, like just some thought you might have.
No, I mean, the thing that's standing out to me, I guess, through a lot of this conversation is memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
You talked about holes in your memory with regard to writing about the Clintons and 92, and you said at one point, it seems like Silicon Valley doesn't remember, right? It's like sort of underneath everything you're talking about with regard to AI, like this looks familiar. Like, I don't know. The function of memory, and maybe it's interrelatedness with what we're talking about in terms of time passing and the way our perspective lands on things. But I don't know. Thoughts on memory, I suppose.
Yeah, I like that question. It immediately, I think adjacent to it is, memories are the stories we tell about the past, right? The things we remember are always, it's storytelling. And I think the connective tissue that connects the Clinton himself and the Clinton years and Silicon Valley have been, really powerful storytelling. That was Silicon Valley's secret. It kind of it had the storytelling edge on Boston. Someone like Steve Jobs, who was able to say in 1980, a computer is like a bicycle for the mind, and really kind of make this exotic product something that people could relate to intellectually and make it tangible. The story that Silicon Valley has told about itself is kind of these wacky, disruptive people doing these wacky, living on the, we're contrarian, we're disruptors. We're painting outside the lines. It's a much more, conservative place than not just politically conservative, but kind of business conservative. Than it lets on. The most successful companies and investors have been doing so by kind of, adhering to good sort of standard business practice. Not always, sometimes they've let some of the, those pesky regulations get in the way. But they haven't cared as much about HR as some other firms have. But there's, the story, the power of I think this is also very interesting when we're writing history where those of us who are writing it and those who are reading it are people who also lived that history. And this is true for any modern historian who's writing kind of in the sort of the half century prior to the moment they're writing. That you're going to have people who it's in their living memory what these events were, but memory is fallible, and the memory is also stories. And we too are telling we are telling the best version of the story we can with the evidence we can. But it's, I think the other challenge, and this alludes to your sort of acceleration or the sort of this question of acceleration of speed of information, is just volume. One of the challenges of any 20th century historian is like weeding through the hundreds of pieces of carbon paper in a manuscript box, right? In an archival box.
Yeah.
And
this
now,
is what the medievalists always say, Crimea River, right?
Yeah, Crimea River, yeah. And then, the 21st century, it's just bewildering. Like, how can we as historians really tell the full story when we have, a million emails that tell that story rather than just 200 pieces of onion skin paper? So there's I don't have it. I wish I had an answer to that. But I think about it a lot, and I think about sort of where does the historian end and the journalist begin, or where is it memoir and where is it, where am I just observing, and where am I a participant, and how do I make that a proper distinction?
I cannot think of a more beautiful place to end than that. That was perfect. That was so much fun. Thank you for coming and hanging out with us.
Yeah, this was awesome.
Fun to hang out with you guys.
Much.
Yeah.
This was great.
Yeah. I want a picture of you in that black shirt, Ben.
Well, that's the 411 home slice. For us, this has been all that and a bag of chips. Word. Mad props for today's guests and contributors, and for all of the hands that helped to make this episode a thing. Our hosts have been Ben Waterhouse of UNC-Chapel Hill and Lee Vinsel of Virginia Tech. The show is created in cloud spaces across the ether, but is anchored right here in the Newman Library Athenaeum on the Blacksburg campus of Virginia Tech. The whole thing chillaxes under the auspices of Virginia Tech Publishing and Press, and the New Books Network distributes our show to all of the places you'll find your podcasts. Along with myself, J.M. Lamb and Graham Conway are editors. Sarah Beatty built the art and animation any YouTube listeners may encounter. I am producer Joe Forte. And this has been the iHeart 90s History Podcast. As a final note, I'd like to say that our deepest and most earnest gratitude has been reserved for you, our dear listener. Thank you very much for listening. Peace out.